for having me, and thank you all for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you today. Like Ellie mentioned, I am a behavioral scientist and a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School, where I study how we can design workplaces that are more equitable and more fair than they are today. And in my work, I found that despite a lot of well-intentioned talk and action, all of our efforts are not translating into real measurable results as quickly and at a scale that we would want and need. So what I hope to share with you today is an evidence-based blueprint for how we can truly level the playing field and start doing things that work faster and more effectively. Let me figure out how I can advance my slides. Here we go. So as we know, diversity is just a fact of life. Whenever more than one human, two or more humans get together, there are differences, visible and invisible, differences based on who we are in terms of our social identities like gender and race, but also we're just different based on preferences and backgrounds and personalities. Just like in this picture here, where we have some people of different heights who have come to see the mountain, but not all of them can at the moment because of a barrier standing in their way. And in organizations, a very typical response to this reality of life is to try to fix the individuals, to lift up the shortest person, to make them just tall enough that their head clears the fence so that they too can see the mountain like everybody else. I'm going to suggest to you today that this is entirely the wrong approach, and that instead what we need to do is to fix the system, to level the playing field and to remove these barriers that are unnecessarily, but also unfairly standing in some people's way, but not others. They're preventing some people from seeing the mountain, but not others. In our workplaces, these barriers are preventing some people, but not others, from showing up as themselves with their expertise, their life experience, and contributing all that knowledge and all their talents to the betterment of our companies. So our charge, if you will, our mission for today is to uncover what these barriers are so that we can take them down once and for all and level the playing field. With that in mind, I want to walk you through 7 evidence-based barriers, which I'm going to call myths today, because that's really what I think they are. They're these mistaken assumptions that we have bought into that are collectively holding us back. The first of these barriers is the myth that we need to de-bias individuals in order to make our workplaces more equitable. We have actually been studying the human brain for decades, in fact, centuries. And sadly, all of this research suggests that it is, at the very least, incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to de-bias human brains. Bias, both unconscious and conscious, is just a fact of how human brains operate. But the really good news is that research has also discovered that we don't have to change our underlying brain patterns in order to behave differently. When we change the context in which we humans make decisions, when we change the physical environments that surround us, the organizational processes and policies that shape how we work, we can actually behave in less biased ways without touching the underlying unconscious bias. The second myth related to this is that we can train our way to equity. We also have been studying various different types of diversity trainings, including unconscious bias trainings, for the last 50 or 60 years. And this research evidence is very consistent. Training does not change behavior. Yes, training can raise awareness. Yes, participants often like training, so they leave a training session very inspired. They feel like they learned all these new things. They rate the session a 10 out of 10 on the feedback form. But then when we as researchers follow up with training participants 3 months later, or 6 months, or 18 months, we don't see them behaving any differently. They are not hiring different people. They are not promoting different people. They are not using more inclusive language. They are not treating colleagues with more respect in everyday interactions. And I would argue to you as a behavioral scientist that the real results we're looking for are changes in behavior in organizations. So unfortunately, as much as we love trainings, They just are not the answer we're looking for. Trainings are one example of programmatic approaches, which we have, again, collectively bought into the myth that these types of programmatic approaches are enough to yield sustainable progress. Other types of programmatic approaches include bringing in a speaker for a one-off talk, organizing a one-off workshop, or a networking event, or a training session. Sometimes even affinity groups or employee resource groups or business resource groups, as they're sometimes called, can be a programmatic intervention if they focus on just organizing a lot of events and programming. The problem with these approaches is that they're not integrated in the mainstream of our everyday work, which means that when budgets get tight, that line item of, oh, we're bringing in the speaker, or, oh, we're organizing the training series, is very easy to cut. Or when your real work overwhelms your calendar and you get very busy, it's so easy to skip that one-off training session or meet and greet. The fact that programmatic approaches are also off to the side, like a splashy International Women's Day event, also says something about how seriously companies take these things. Right? If we were truly serious about embedding equity into our work, we would dedicate more than 1 hour a year, or 1 day a year, or even more than 1 month a year to this work. The next myth is that equity is the responsibility of DEI professionals alone. Now, don't get me wrong. Chief diversity officers, diversity, equity, and inclusion experts, or whatever their titles are, can play an incredibly important role in raising awareness, propagating evidence-based practices, and giving all employees the tools that they need to do their work better and smarter. But a DEI office of 2 or even 5 or 10 people can't be expected to make equity happen for an organization of hundreds or thousands of employees, let alone tens of thousands. If you think about it, most companies have a corporate communication department that employs some people who are real experts and specialists in communication, and that's wonderful. But every single employee has to write emails on a daily basis, create slides, speak up in meetings, give presentations in front of their colleagues. What I'm saying is that every single employee in the organization needs a base level of communication skills in order for the organization to function, even though we also employ experts who are specialists in communication. This is exactly the same approach that we have to take with equity as well. The next myth is maybe the trickiest, and it's the myth that equity is not compatible with meritocracy. I find the concept of meritocracy to be a little bit difficult, a little bit complex, because what I would argue to you is that our world has never yet seen a true meritocracy in action. Instead, we're living in a world that's described by the picture you see on the slide, where we're all running a race on what looks like the same track, except some people's starting line is moved way forward, whereas some people's starting line is moved way back. And in order for a true meritocracy, what we need to do is move everyone to the same starting line so that they have the same distance to run. And then we have to go further and make sure that they have the same support and the same equipment to run with, so that some people don't get the latest, most technically advanced fancy sneakers, whereas other people have to run with old, worn-out models. And that's the work of leveling the playing field that we have to do in our organizations. For a true meritocracy to be present, we have to make sure everyone starts on the same starting line and gets equal support to succeed. Unfortunately, that is not happening today. The data is very clear on this point. There's another myth, which some people call the mythical fixed pie mindset, or the zero-sum fallacy, that your gain has to equal my loss. If you rise, I must fall. But this is just not true in reality. Yes, there are, of course, some situations in life that are actually zero-sum. If I'm haggling, negotiating over the price of an item with a merchant, the less money I pay, the less money the merchant gets. And in most parliaments, for example, the number of seats are fixed. So if one person wins the seat, another person loses the seat. But these types of zero-sum situations are much rarer in real life than are our zero-sum beliefs. I want to give you the example of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a law that we have in the United States, instituted in the early 1990s, whose aim was to make it easier for citizens of all different abilities to participate in everyday life. This law required, among other things, that elevators and ramps be installed in public places and that the curbs between sidewalks and streets and roads be smoothed out. Now, of course, the benefits were clear for people with mobility challenges, for people using wheelchairs, for example. But if you think about it, parents who are pushing their kids around in a stroller also benefited from having an elevator or a smooth curb. So did older citizens who went to the grocery store and put their stuff in a cart on their way home. So did young people who were taking public transportation with their bike. In other words, a redesign of the physical environment that was initially inspired by the needs of people with different characteristics and different needs actually turned out to make the world better, more accessible, and easier to navigate for absolutely everyone. And this is exactly the promise of equity. When we work smarter, when we level the playing field and remove barriers, we all get to benefit from more objective processes, from cultures that are better at fostering human thriving, the thriving of all of us, and simply better organizations. For us all to win, nobody has to lose. And finally, in order to get here, we need to let go of the myth that equity is somehow different than all other business imperatives. If you work in an organization that sells anything, whether that be products or services or ideas, imagine what happens when your company discovers that sales are lagging. What do? How do you tackle this problem? Do you put people in small groups to have roundtable discussions about their feelings about sales? Or do you organize a company-wide sales appreciation day? No, I don't think so. Based on my work with real companies, what they do is they dive right into the data to understand exactly where sales are lagging and why and what's driving it. Then they set goals and targets to hold people accountable and motivate them to do better. And they associate incentives with those targets so that if you meet your targets, you get rewarded. And if you underperform, there's negative consequences. And then you as a company might change some of your policies or procedures around sales to help make it easier for you to deliver on your ambitious goals. If this is how we manage our core business, so to speak, then this is precisely the data-driven, rigorously analytical way that we have to manage equity in our organizations as well. We need to rely on data. We need to be clear about what we want to achieve in terms of goals or targets or aspirations. We have to hold people accountable to those goals and targets so that there are consequences. And then we have to redesign our systems to support us reaching those goals and targets. We already have this muscle. We're applying it already in a different part of our business. We just have to realize that we can do exactly the same when we manage equity. So there you have it. That is the evidence-based blueprint for how to level the playing field in our organizations. To recap, we have to focus on debiasing systems rather than individuals. Among other things, that means that if we want to change behavior, we got to let go of the focus on training and instead spend our precious and limited money, time, and effort on redesigning our organizational processes and policies. How we hire, how we promote, how we give feedback, who gets to go and leave and when and for how long, who gets to work from somewhere other than the office and when and why. These are the types of policies and procedures I'm talking about. We also have to embed equity and inclusion into the mainstream of our everyday work instead of viewing it as a one-off side activity that we do once or a handful of times a year. And we have to engage everybody in our organizations, from the most junior summer intern to the CEO, in embedding equity into their own work, doing their own work in a fairer and smarter way. We also need to reframe the conversation and remind ourselves that the world has never yet seen a real meritocracy in action. But that doesn't mean that we can't take massive leaps to get there. And in a similar vein, we also have to remind ourselves that we all can benefit from a more equitable, fairer, more objective workplace. This is not about lifting some people up at the expense of others and pulling others down. On the contrary, this is lifting all of us up on a scale that we have never seen, where we all can get to benefit from better organizations, higher performing organizations that can tap an unprecedentedly large talent pool, which also means that we just get to work with more interesting fellow humans. And in order to make all this happen, we have to treat and approach equity in exactly the same way as we approach all of our other business imperatives. No more, no less. I am so delighted to join you today, and I would love to continue the conversation. You can find me at Siri Chilazi on LinkedIn. And if we have time right now, I would love to hear your questions, your comments, any thoughts that you have about the topics that we've discussed. Thank you so much for being here today.